All right. Maybe just give it like a few more seconds here. But thanks for coming out anyways. Appreciate it. Always happy to talk about salamanders. And yeah, I hope this is informative for people because this is definitely something I think should be shared more broadly. All right. We'll just jump right into things. Thanks for coming again. My name is Matt. I work for the Finger Lakes Prism, and we'll be talking about salamanders and Bsal today. So we'll jump into why specifically this is I consider this a big topic, but just for some context here, I am the terrestrial invasive species coordinator for the Finger Lakes Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. I'll just check that. Yes, great. We are a partnership between the Finger Lakes Institute and Hobart Williams Colleges and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation with the goal of managing invasive species within the 17 county Finger Lakes region. So we are the largest prism by land area. There are 8 prisms in New York State that all kind of have similar arrangements, just with different organizations between the DEC. In all of the different parts of New York State, we are the largest one, which makes our jobs kind of difficult because it means we're often stretched between really big areas like Rochester and Syracuse and Binghamton and Ithaca and all kinds of different places like that. This week is New York's Invasive Species Awareness Week, otherwise known as NISAW. And so this is part of a series of webinars that are statewide all throughout the week. So thanks for coming in for this one. And if you haven't attended any others already, I would encourage you to check out some of the others that are going to be going on throughout the rest of the week. So really, I kind of want to start us off with this question here. And I was asked this question by a professor of mine when I was back in college, and we were talking about invasive species. And we started class one day, and he just posted this question to all of us: what is the worst invasive species? And since we're a smaller group here, if anyone wants to like unmute themselves and give some shout outs as to what they think, what is the worst invasive species ever in the history of the world? You can type in the chat as well. What do you think the worst invasive species ever has been? Any guesses? All right, so I'm gonna open up the chat here. Humans from George. I mean, I wouldn't argue with you there. We also have humans from Terra. Yeah, it's a pretty common answer. I feel like I don't get through a presentation without someone saying humans are invasive species. I think there's maybe some nuance there, but generally when we're thinking about, what is the worst invasive species in the world, and we're thinking about like non-humans here, we'll generally come up with a list like this, right? You could talk about maybe rabbits in Australia. You could talk about like kudzu. You could talk about Burmese pythons, the chestnut plate, cane toads in Australia, cats. I mean, cats pretty much just like everywhere. Zebra mussels, rats or mice, Burmese pythons. There's a lot. These are often many of the examples people will give when they talk about what is the worst invasive species in the world. And this is, when I was posed this question, these were a lot of the answers that a lot of people had come to. And he gave a pretty interesting answer as to what he thought the worst invasive species in the world was. And that is BD, otherwise known as the chytrid fungus. This is a very famous example of an invasive pathogen. For those of you who aren't familiar, BD is a invasive fungus that arrived in Central and South America back in the 70s or 80s, I believe, and it has had a dramatic impact on their frog populations. And according to research, BD, or again, otherwise commonly just known as chytrid, has been responsible for the decline of at least 501 amphibian species over the past half century, including 90 presumed extinction. So this is an extreme impact, right? There are very few invasive species, and we're here in New York, right? So a lot of our invasive species are things like, honeysuckle, things like zebra mussels, and I don't think either of those species or ones like them are responsible for something as many as 90 presumed extinctions. And studies further go on to say that that chytrid, specifically BD, represents the greatest documented loss of biodiversity attributable to a pathogen and places BD among the most destructive invasive species, comparable to all rodents, threatening 420 species worldwide, and cats, which threaten 430 species worldwide. And losses associated with chytridiomycosis are orders of magnitude greater than for other high profile wildlife pathogens. So when we think about things like white nose syndrome affecting bats or West Nile virus in birds, of the 501 declined amphibian species, 90 are confirmed or presumed extinct in the wild, with a further 124 species experiencing a greater 90% reduction in abundance. So BD has had a dramatic impact on global frog biodiversity. And unfortunately, and actually, before I get ahead of myself here, here's just like a map showing like what we're looking at worldwide. So you can see some really big declines in Mesoamerica, right? So that's like like southern and central America, in Brazil, South America, where we've seen the biggest impacts. Some other impacts, places like Oceania, but really like some huge impacts places like these. And move this out so you can see it. And unfortunately, we are now seeing the same thing, very similar situation playing out with salamanders. And this has recently been discovered in Europe, where there is a similar chytrid disease that is affecting their salamanders there. And it is having some very, very dramatic impacts on European salamander populations. And I think this is important for a few reasons. One, let's take a look at global biodiversity and why this is such a specifically concerning issue for us here in New York State. So this is vertebrate species richness over the entire planet. And the areas that are darker in red are areas where there's higher biodiversity, and the areas that are blue have lower biodiversity. And when you look at a map of global biodiversity, this is typically what you see, right? Like species being concentrated along the equator in the tropics, and as you go closer towards the poles, biodiversity tends to drop out. And this is all vertebrates, but we kind of dive down into more specific variables here. When we look at bird richness, pretty much follows the same pattern, right? The Amazon, Congo, Southeast Asian tropical rainforests have the most biodiversity of terrestrial ecosystems. Mammals, same story, right? Amazon, Congo, Southeast Asia. When we look at the global biodiversity of vascular plants, again, on this map, the darker the red, the more biodiversity. And we can see that's really concentrated towards the equator, right? We can kind of see down like the strip of the Andes over here, the Congo, Southeast Asia. There's some exceptions, like here in Southern Africa, where we have some biodiversity, but by and large, it's the same places where we see the most biodiversity for all kinds of different taxa. And here's that same map, but with frogs. And again, South America really pulling its weight here in terms of global biodiversity. Now, if I'm framing this as something that's going to be important to us in New York State, but all of these different maps are showing that biodiversity is highest towards the equator, then why is this something that we here in New York should be concerned about? Because I'll tell you, the map for salamanders for global biodiversity looks very different than all of the other maps that we've seen so far. So looking at this map here, we can first of all see that there are a lot of areas around the world where salamanders are just straight up absent, right? Like pretty much most of Africa, with a couple exceptions here along the northwestern coast, most of southern and central Asia, gone, most of Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, gone, even South America, right? That heavy weight of biodiversity across all these different maps. There's some, but not a ton. And when we look at the areas where there's the most salamander biodiversity, Eastern North America is the place. we have by far more salamander species than anywhere else in the world. And when we think about, wildlife in North America generally, right, we tend to think that the Western United States has a lot more biodiversity or just abundance of wildlife. We think about places like Yellowstone that have bison and pronghorns and wolves and elk and moose and all these different kinds of really big, charismatic megafauna. But really, it is the eastern seaboard, the eastern half of the United States, where we see the greatest salamander biodiversity. And according to at least one resource, this is AmphibiaWeb, there are as many as 228 salamander species spread across North America, with the overwhelming majority of those being concentrated in the eastern US. So, if you're ever find yourself in an argument with someone from Brazil or someone from Kenya and you're arguing about like cool organisms that you have in your respective places, you can let them know that we have way more salamanders than they do. Salamanders are really interesting animals. So salamanders are amphibians, and kind of just as a rule here, amphibians are generally restricted to at least some portion of their lives to water, and they have a thin, breathable skin. Which means that unlike our skin, which is generally going to be waterproof, their skin allows for the passage of a lot of different gases and liquids between them. There are about 813 salamander species worldwide. They represent about 9% of all amphibian species. And again, just in the United States, we have about a quarter of those. Eastern North America is the center of both global salamander diversity and abundance. And there's some key differences here between salamanders and frogs. And I think maybe the most relevant difference, at least right now, in terms of defining what a salamander is that the difference, if we kind of take ourselves back to, like intro to ecology, the difference between an R and a K selected species. Frogs are, typically species that reproduce really quickly and don't live very long. Frogs very rarely, as a general rule, live longer than 5 years in the wilds. However, salamanders reproduce a lot more slowly, and they can often live for decades. Even little teeny little salamanders like eastern redbacks that you'll find by flipping logs here in any kind of forest in New York. And there are some species like hellbenders that have been recorded as reaching over 50 years in the wild. So in terms of just general life strategies, salamanders have some key differences from frogs. Now here in New York, we have lots of different species of salamanders. Depending on who you ask, we have somewhere maybe a little bit under, maybe a little bit above 20 different species, and they are spread across 5 different families. We have Plethodontidae. This is our most biodiverse group of salamanders, and they are the most biodiverse group of salamanders in the world. These are the lungless salamanders, so they no longer have any lungs. They are just able to breathe completely through from their skin and through other means. And then we have Salamandridae. These are newts. These are considered like the true salamanders, quote unquote. We only have one species of this in New York. That is the eastern red-spotted newt, or the red F's. Then we have Ambistomidae. These are our mole salamanders. These salamanders, this is the second most diverse group of salamanders in New York. They tend to be quite larger than some of the other salamanders that we have, but they do spend most of their lives underground. So for most of the year, you don't typically see these guys. Although generally when in springtime, when there are salamander migrations and they're moving to vernal pools to reproduce, these are the salamanders that are going on those kinds of migrations. Finally, in these last 2 families here, we only have one species each in New York. There's Proteidae. These are the mud puppies. These are fully aquatic salamanders that spend most of their time in large water bodies, so like pretty big lakes. And the Cryptobranchidae, these are the hellbenders. So this is an endangered species here in New York. And they are also, like mud puppies, completely restricted to water throughout the entirety of their life cycle. And unlike mud puppies, though, which spend most of their times in ponds and lakes, hellbenders will spend their time in fast-flowing, well-oxygenated, cool streams. And so even amongst the salamanders that we have in New York, we can see here that there is quite an array of different life strategies and different niches that these guys take up. And they are really, really important to our local ecology because they play a lot of different roles in our ecosystem. I think most importantly, in terms of what salamanders do, is that salamanders play a unique role in that they are both predators and prey. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, what that means in just a second. But also, salamanders are really important in connecting our terrestrial and our aquatic ecosystems. And this is something that, you know, different groups of salamanders are going to play different roles. So something like a hellbender or a mud puppy maybe not going to play a big role between connecting like terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, but Amphistromidae or mole salamanders definitely are. So keep in mind that this isn't necessarily the things we're about to discuss and why salamanders are so important. Doesn't apply universally to all of these, but it will apply in some way to some of these species. So, for one, salamanders, when we're thinking about terrestrially, they are the apex predators of the soil environment. So, when we're thinking about our soil fauna, all the little creepy critters that are crawling around in the soil, they are essentially like the lions down there. They are eating anything they can fit in their mouths, and they play a really big role in regulating the populations of all different kinds of little creatures and critters that are living in soil fauna. So this could be like roly-polies. This could be worms. This could be centipedes. This could be millipedes. This could be collembolans, otherwise known as springtails, insects, arachnids. They are generally some of the larger organisms that are going to be spending time down there, and they have a really big impact on affecting what the soil fauna throughout our soil profiles look like. And they also have really big impacts when they are in their aquatic stages as well. So there's some really key differences here between salamander and frog life stages. So generally, salamanders generally will follow the same kind of life cycle that a frog and many other amphibians do, where they are born in water and then they eventually migrate onto land. There's some exceptions to that, but by and large, as a rule, that is what salamanders are doing. However, the larvae of salamanders are very different from frogs. First of all, they're not even called tadpoles like frogs are. They are just called larvae. And frog tadpoles are completely herbivorous. So they are generally just feeding on things like algae within the water body that they find themselves in. Salamander larvae, however, are carnivorous. And we can even see that here, pictured here. I'm not sure exactly what the salamander larva is eating, but it's eating something. So that even when they're at these early life stages, they are having some really dramatic impacts on the water bodies that they inhabit. Because salamander larvae, when we're thinking about our aquatic ecosystems, and generally, when we're looking at things like water quality, we are looking at, the diversity and abundance of macroinvertebrates. Well, salamander larvae are often the predators of those macroinvertebrates. And this is especially important in ecosystems where we don't have fish populations, which in New York, we have a lot of these. When we're thinking about, headwater streams of hills surrounding the Finger Lakes, up in the mountains of the Adirondacks and the Catskills, these environments, these little headwater streams way up in the hills, where the water's maybe only like a couple of inches deep and might dry out for some parts of the year. Fish can't survive here. Well, what's controlling those macroinvertebrate populations are often salamander larvae. Those are the only things often that are controlling those macroinvertebrate populations. That's also true for vernal pools as well. We are here in New York, we are littered with vernal pools throughout our forests across the state. And these ecosystems are generally places where fish cannot get to because they dry out for some time of the year. But when salamander larvae are laying their eggs, they are the ones that are controlling the macroinvertebrate populations within these areas. So they play really, really, really important roles in terms of top-down effects of predation on all kinds of different invertebrates in both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. And with that being said, salamanders themselves are really small. So they are food for many larger organisms as well. So they play a really big role in transferring nutrients and energy from these lower trophic levels into higher trophic levels. And lots of different mammals, fish, and reptiles heavily rely on salamanders to be that key connector between all these little itty bitty critters and all of these much larger critters. And salamander migrations, and this is especially true with our mole salamanders, the Ambistomidae, as they are moving and migrating between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, they are often playing a really big role, very similar, maybe not as pronounced, but very similar to what salmon do in the Pacific Northwest, where they are transferring nutrients and energy between terrestrial ecosystems and the ocean. Salamanders are doing the exact same thing as they're doing their migrations between terrestrial forested ecosystems and freshwater aquatic ecosystems. So there are a lot of reasons as to why salamanders are really, really important. And we could spend, hours and hours a day talking about the positive impacts that they have, the really key roles that they play, whether that's being apex predators, whether that's transferring energy, converting biomass, all kinds of different things like that. And there's lots of studies that do corroborate this and do show some degree of causality between, aquatic and terrestrial ecosystem coupling, energy sources being an energy source for higher trophic levels, and causing top-down trophic cascades. Unfortunately, though, all of this is threatened by what's pictured here. And this is our big concern when it comes to salamanders. This, what we're looking at here, folks, is a microscopic picture of Bsal. Bsal is an abbreviation of the scientific name Batrachochytrium, salamandrivorans. This is a fungal disease that originally originating from Asia that infects the skin of the salamanders. And we talked about before how important the skin is in general to amphibians. And essentially, in a nutshell, what Bsal does is it destroys their skin. And if you're destroying amphibian skin, you're essentially destroying their ability to breathe. Studies have shown that B-cell on average can kill any given North American salamander within about 21 days to about 3 weeks of infection, and it can infest any life stage of a salamander. So that's the larva, that's the adults. I am assuming this also means the eggs. I haven't really seen any information about the eggs specifically, but either way, affecting the larva and affecting adults is a really big concern. Now, we don't have Bsal yet, but if Bsal ever arrived, it would essentially be impossible to eradicate here in North America, right? This is something that would be similar in effect to many other very famous, invasive fungal diseases, like BD, like the chestnut blight, like white nose syndrome, Dutch elm disease, whatever, invasive fungal disease suits your fancy, like Bsal was going to have very similar impacts as along the lines of a lot of those other diseases. And a big issue is that Bsal can spread along a wide variety of pathways. So while it does affect salamanders and it is toxic to them, Bsal has been seen to vector through other amphibians like frogs. Now, as far as we can tell, it doesn't really affect frogs in the same way that it affects salamanders. It can go onto waterfowl as well. So ducks, geese, all kinds of different birds can be vectors for this, and even humans. It could track onto human clothing or human equipment and be moved around. So if Bsal ever did get here to North America, it would have no problem to spread across our continent very quickly. Now, let's maybe back up a second here and talk about what actually is Bsal. Like, what is a chytrid fungus? So Bsal is a chytrid, similar to BD, as we had talked about earlier. Chytrids are a phylum of microscopic unicellular fungi. And a phylum, if we're remembering back to like our biology 101 days, a phylum is a really large grouping of organisms. I think like vertebrates, all vertebrates are a phylum, all arthropods are a phylum. So we're talking about a really large array of an incredibly diverse amount of species. And so both Bsal and BD are chytrid fungi. They belong to that phylum, which means that they are very distantly related to many more recognizable fungi, like our mycorrhizal fungi, our saprotrophic fungi, like the big kind of charismatic, fungi that we typically see in the woods, like our shelf fungi growing on like logs and trees and stuff like that. These are not the fungi that we're talking about. We are talking about small unicellular fungi. And one thing that is true across all chytrids is that they have to be in water to survive. Now, some research has been done on the susceptibility of North American salamander species in being infected by Bsal. And we've gotten some pretty mixed results in terms of what the impacts could be. So here is a diagram showing a bunch of different salamander species that were tested for Bsal, and what essentially these different colors mean are different salamander families. So over here in this red, these all these species that have the genus that starts with A, these are ambistomids. So these are our mole salamanders. So this is like spotted salamander or blue spotted salamander that we see pictured on the right over here. The size of the circle represents the mortality. So we could see across the board, and this, given that this is just laboratory conditions, so it might be different once it actually gets into the wilds, but at least from what we've seen in the lab, ambistomids actually don't really see very much mortality from Bsal at all. So there's at least some safety in knowing that this maybe won't affect all of our salamander species equally. On the flip side, though, when we look here on the left-hand side in this blue area, these species are salamandrids, otherwise known as newts. And we can see very large circles for these species. And this species right here, N. viridescens, this is the eastern red-spotted salamander, so the red Fs that you very commonly see along trails and in forested ecosystems. They are pretty heavily impacted by Bsal, unfortunately. And we also see that with what we see this big section of the chart here on the bottom with plethodontids. Now, we have a lot of different species that they tested here. Some of these species aren't in New York. Some of these species are, but we are seeing, at least with a few of them, like E. bislinearia, or with P. ruber. These are both species that are native to New York, and we can see that those circles are quite large, and they actually do have some pretty big negative impacts. So for both newts and for plethodontids, like our two-line salamander pictured here, we would expect to see some really, really big impacts. For other species, thinking about the rest of our salamander families, Nectaris maculosus pictured right between these two groups. These are mud puppies. They seem to be okay. Cryptobranchus alleghaniensis pictured up here. These are hellbenders. They seem to be okay as well, which is a really quite a relief for us because this is already an endangered species. So again, seeing some pretty mixed impacts, but that being said, the fact that we are seeing some really large circles here is still quite a concern for a lot of our newts and plethodontids. Impact of Bsal likely to be really, really massive. Devastating impacts on newts across the board. And we don't have as many newts here in New York, but in other parts of the country, like especially on the West Coast in California and the Pacific Northwest, down south as well, they do have a lot more newts there. So that is something that is really concerning to other people throughout the country. And even going beyond newts, like I've said, severe impacts on plethodontids. And I really do want to drive this point home here. If Bsal was ever introduced to North America, it would be impossible to eradicate and would likely become a continent-wide disease very similar to white nose syndrome. And I don't want to sound too alarmist here, but I definitely think, given the diversity of salamander species we have here in North America and the impacts that we've seen with BD in places like Central and South America, I do genuinely believe that if Bsal made it to North America, species extinction would be on the table. Would every species of salamander go extinct? Probably not. Would at least a few? Probably. Here's a map demonstrating that risk over the course of the entire continental United States. The darker the red, the higher the risk. And we could see here in New York, we have a lot of risk. We're one of the darkest red areas, especially within the New York City metro area down here. There is some really concerning risks. So if Bsal does make it to North America, we are likely going to be in the crosshairs of some pretty significant impacts. We could also see some other clusters as well throughout the country. Down here in the southern Appalachians, in the Smoky Mountains, this is where salamander biodiversity is the highest in the world. So they definitely have reasons to be concerned down here. And we can see on the west coast here too, California, Pacific Northwest, they tend to have more newt species out here, and newts in general, for some reason, seem to be more susceptible to Bsal. So they also have some pretty big cause for concern out there. Now, I know what I just said sounds really, really depressing, and I'm only making it seem that way because I really want to drive home how important and devastating I think the impact of this disease could be. But I do want to make it clear, though, that there actually is a lot being done behind the scenes with Bsal right now across a wide variety of different groups, whether we're looking at the national level, the state level, and the research level. So we're going to dive into all three of these areas in turn and see what has already been done on the table. So in terms of the national level, there actually is a joint North American Bsal task force. And this was established a few years ago by the US, Canadian, and Mexican governments. And it's made up of a wide variety of different partners who have an interest in preventing the spread of Bsal. So this includes things like the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Council, PARC, Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, the Canadian Herpetological Health Group, many, many more organizations. Within the Bsal task force, there are 8 different working groups led by researchers from across North America that are looking into things like diagnostics, education outreach, and a whole host of other things. In terms of policy, already Canada has placed strict limits on the imports of all salamander species into the country. And here in the United States, we have listed, the Fish and Wildlife Service has listed 201 species as being injurious, meaning that you would need a permit in order to legally import those species. I wasn't able to find any information on what Mexico has done so far, but given the fact that the United States has the largest population, and we are the most likely pathway for Bsal to enter, I would consider that focusing things on the U.S. level would probably be our biggest priority, at least as far as things stand right now. Now, at the state level, the DEC is taking some action here. So the DEC has begun active discussions on how to address Bsal, and they do have a plan for a response within New York State within sometime in the near future. I originally had made this PowerPoint slide a few months ago last year, so this might have changed. I haven't heard any updates from the state level. If there's anyone here who does know on what the DEC has done, it'd be really interested in hearing if there have been any updates. But either way, even if they haven't had these updates yet, the DEC has begun to formulate a response plan for Bsal within New York State. They're going to be seeking input from the DEC Reptile and Amphibian Diversity Team, followed up by the Bureau of Wildlife later on. And at the moment, the Cornell Wildlife Health Lab has a PCR test for Bsal currently available. So if you have salamanders that you think are infected with Bsal, you could send them there, and they can test them. And they do all testing for Bsal contamination, all wild herps that come through their animal hospital. Furthermore, on the research level, there is a widespread Bsal monitoring network in North America and has confirmed as of 2022 that it is not present in North America yet. And work has shown some initially promising results in treatment of infected salamanders, but there's still a lot more work needs to be done before we call this a potential cure for Bsal. So all this being said, I want to really highlight the good news that I kind of just hinted at in the last slide. Bsal is not in any North American amphibian populations as far as we can tell, which is really great because this means that we are able to focus on our efforts purely on prevention at this point. We do not have to worry about eradication or containment or management of Bsal at this very moment. As it relates to how we just deal with Bsal in general. We can completely focus on prevention, which means we have a lot of potential options. So given that I just threw a lot of information at you guys about salamanders, about Bsal, and what is currently being done, it might seem really kind of confusing in terms of like, okay, I understand all this information, Matt, but like, where do we really like go from here? What can we do? So we actually do have some options, and I think given the stage of where we are in Bsal's potential invasion of North America, our options are actually fairly easy to discern. Because really, Bsal is fairly simple. Given that the global distribution of salamanders is largely concentrated in North America, Europe, and Eastern Asia. We don't have to worry about Bsal potentially coming from any kind of different environment in the world. It's really, if it's going to get here, it's going to come from either of two places, Eastern Asia or Europe. So our pathways are very clear in terms of the geography of where this disease could come from. And there really is only one major pathway that Bsal can spread along, and that is the pet trade. When Bsal was first detected in Europe about a decade ago now, it is now likely believed that it originated from salamanders that were pet salamanders from Asian salamanders that had been imported into Europe. And so we would expect Bsal to follow along pretty much the exact same pathway that it had into Europe, which I feel like maybe doesn't give us a sense of like how beneficial that is. Because I think with a lot of other invasive species, when we're thinking about things like Stieber mussels, when we're thinking about things like spotted lanternfly, there are often an incredibly complex array of different pathways that these species can come across, and often they are unintentional, right? They are coming on ballast water, they are coming through like cargo and container ships, and they could potentially be introduced from many different areas of the world. Bsal, we have two very distinct regions it could come from, and we have one main pathway that it spreads across the pet trade, which means that we can really focus down our efforts in terms of being able to prevent the spread of Bsal here in North America. So the way we have started approaching this so far from the Finger Lakes Prism's perspective is through two different areas. Prevention option number one is just general education and outreach. From what I can tell so far in my discussions with other terrestrial invasive species coordinators, with a lot of our partners, education on Bsal is often quite lacking in both the Finger Lakes region and I believe New York State broadly. Hence the reason why I'm having this presentation here today. So I think there's a number of ways we can work independently and in partnership to increase Bsal awareness. Doing things like, creating Bsal themed education events, plugging into well-known herp themed events run by partners. I'm thinking especially like if you know of any, spots that have annual salamander migrations, this could be a great place to tell people about Bsal because they could be potentially spreading, if they are infected with Bsal, if they have like a pet salamander at home or something, they could be spreading it to those wild populations by helping those salamanders cross the road during the yearly migrations in March and April. Working with local organizations, there's lots of different herp clubs on college campuses, social media groups, creating Bsal related outreach material. And we've done that here at the Finger Lakes Prism. We've designed both of these flyers in-house. And we have a wide variety of flyers available. And if people are interested in sharing and spreading these, I'd be happy to give you copies. Both of just like general, what is a salamander, what is Bsal, how does Bsal spread, knowing different vectors, and flyers covering other topics as well. And generally here at the Prism, we are incorporating just Bsal awareness more and more into our general education outreach when we do events to all kinds of different groups within our region. The other main prevention option that is available to us is diagnostic support. So one area of the North American Bsal Task Force that they've set up is this organization called SNAPS. This is the Student Network for Amphibian Pathogen Surveillance. And essentially it's a program where they recruit university herpetology classes to go out in the field and collect samples from wild salamander populations to determine if Bsal is present in North America. As of the last time I checked, and this was fall of last year, there are around 80 to 100 different universities across the country that are taking part in this. And one thing that we've been able to do to at least help increase the diagnostic support of for Bsal in our region is to get more local universities involved. There was in our 17 counties here in the Finger Lakes Prism, before we had started taking a look at Bsal, there was only, to my knowledge, one university that was looking at that was already a part of SNAPS. We've been able to add 3 local universities to that network, that being Hobart and William Smith Colleges, SUNY ESF, and Finger Lakes Community College. So if you have contacts at local universities that you think would be interested in doing something like this is a program that generally takes place during the fall, and you have to apply at least a year in advance because SNAPS provides you with all of the necessary equipment in order to take these samples. I would consider contacting local universities that you know who might be interested right now, and seeing if you could apply for the 2025 program year in this upcoming fall. If you are interested, I would recommend reaching out to Megan Winsler. She's the one who runs this program, and you can see her email address over here. I could also send out this email address afterwards as well if people are interested. So that's pretty much the gist when it comes to Bsal. And I want to leave us here on one final note, noting that oftentimes as invasive species managers, we talk a lot about early detection, rapid response, and prevention. But unfortunately, a lot of our activities, our energy, our funding is devoted towards those tier 3 and tier 4 invasive species that are already really widespread and are having very large, very immediate impacts. Many of these species of which are pictured here. And I think what Bsal represents for us as invasive species managers collectively is the ability to focus on prevention of an invasive species that could potentially have an impact that is far greater than even many of these other invasive species have had. This is a really rare opportunity. We don't often get the chance to learn about an invasive species and know a lot about it before it gets here and have such an easy and straightforward pathway and options available to us to deal with it. So I would encourage all of you, if you are interested in helping prevent Bsal from getting here, this is a huge bang for your buck. We're talking about, really simple steps to take, just helping with diagnostic support and education and outreach to relevant stakeholder groups to prevent what could be an extinction level event for many species of some of our most important organisms here in New York State and in North America in general. Here, I have pictured all the salamander species that are native to New York State. Again, depending on who you ask, this number can run from as low as 18 to as many as like 23 to 25. And, often when we're working with invasive species, I feel like we kind of get so focused on trying to manage the invasive species that we forget what we're actually trying to protect. And this is it, right? These are all of these amazing salamanders that play such valuable and vital roles within our ecosystems are well worth our time and energy and efforts to protect. So thank you all for coming here, taking time out of your busy schedules to learn more about Bsal. I hope you were able to take something away from this. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And if you have something that you need to go or you think about later, after we depart for today, shoot me an email, my email address here, and be happy to address any questions on Bsal. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to end the recording here.